I still can't sleep properly. Every time I shut my eyes, those yellow eyes reappear. 2 dim lanterns, burning out in a forest that should have been empty. People ask why I don't hike anymore, why the mountains no longer call to me. I tell them I'm busy. That's a lie. The truth is heavier than anyone around me could bear, and heavier than I can keep inside. This is what really happened that October weekend in the Cascades. It was supposed to be simple. 3 days alone in the wilderness, to clear my head after a rough stretch at work and a breakup that had left me hollow. I wasn't looking for danger or adventure, just quiet. I packed light, a small tent, freeze-dried meals, my camera. Nothing extreme. I'd done this route twice before without any trouble. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when I pulled in that Friday afternoon. Only one other car sat there, a thin layer of pine needles already gathering on its hood. Perfect. Solitude was exactly what I wanted. The first day passed without incident. I made good time on the main trail and pitched camp near a creek 8 miles in. The water ran so clear it looked like melted glass slipping over stones. The air was cool but forgiving. The sky a soft gray dome promising no storms. I ate my meal, watched the stars scatter themselves across the darkness, and let the sound of rushing water pull me into sleep. If I'd known what was waiting, I would have packed up right then, hiked out by moonlight, and never returned. Saturday morning began gently. Thin light filtering through the canopy, a faint mist rising from the creek, the scent of wet cedar like a ghost of rain. I broke camp early, continuing deeper into the wilderness. The trail narrowed as the day went on, shouldering closer to cliffs and dropping into gulches thick with ferns. By mid-afternoon, I reached a section I didn't remember from previous trips, a fork unmarked on my map. The left path looked trampled, beaten into shape by hikers' boots. The right seemed less traveled, curling toward a ridge where sunlight flickered like gold through the trees. I'd brought my camera to catch landscapes, and that ridge promised the perfect view. I went right. The climb steepened fast. My breathing turned ragged, my thighs burning. But the view that unfolded was worth every step. Ridge after ridge of unbroken, green stretching to the horizon, like the ribs of some sleeping giant. I lost track of time taking pictures, angles, shadows, details of moss on stone. When I finally checked my watch, it was just after 4. Less than 3 hours until sunset. I turned to retrace my steps, moving faster now. But the forest had shifted. What had been dappled light and clear shapes only an hour ago was now all shadow and repetition. Every tree looked like the next. The path behind me had dissolved. I forced myself to stop, breathe, think. Compass, map, daylight left. No signal on my phone, but that was expected. This wasn't a life-threatening situation yet. Worst case, I'd spend an uncomfortable night out here and find my way back in the morning. I chose what looked like the most logical direction and started walking. The underbrush thickened, fallen logs like dark bones across the ground. My progress slowed. Every few minutes I'd stop, listening for a clue, a river, a road, anything, nothing, no birdsong, no insects, no wind, only a soundless pressure. Like the forest was holding its pulse for something I couldn't see. By the time the sun began to sink, the temperature dropped with it. My light jacket felt like paper against the cold. I still had water and some food in my day pack, but my tent and sleeping bag were miles behind me. I needed to find some form of shelter before nightfall. That's when I heard the first howl, long, low, echoing across the slopes. My blood thinned with fear. Wolves. I'd read that they were returning to these mountains but had never seen them myself. Another howl rose, closer, answered from a different direction. They were communicating, closing in. I moved faster, no longer caring about direction, just trying to put distance between me and those sounds. Branches lashed my arms, roots snagged my boots. The howls kept coming, surrounding me now. And then I saw them, eyes glinting green-yellow between the trees. Maybe 50 yards to my left, another pair on the right. They were flanking me, hurting me. My hands shook as I pulled out my flashlight and swept its beam across the dark. Gray shapes slipped between the trunks, lean bodies low to the ground, waiting. At least 5, maybe more. They hadn't attacked yet. They were studying me, deciding when. My survival instinct screamed to run, but I knew that would trigger the chase. I tried to make myself big, back away slowly. My boots crunched on frost-stiff leaves. One of the wolves growled, a sound so deep it vibrated in my chest. Then I saw it, a dark slash in the rock face ahead, barely 30 yards away. A cave, my only chance. I edged backward, the wolves gliding closer. One tested me with a lunge, teeth flashing white. I bolted. They exploded behind me, paws tearing at the ground, snarls rising like a storm. My legs pumped, lungs burning. 20 yards, 15, I could hear them breathing. 10. A hot snap of jaws at my ankle. 5. I dove for the opening, wedging myself through a gap in the rocks barely wider than my shoulders. Something tugged at my boot. I kicked back hard, felt a solid impact, heard a yelp. Then I was through, scrambling deeper into blackness. The wolves circled outside, their growls echoing off the stone, but the entrance was too narrow. They couldn't follow. I collapsed against the cave wall, chest heaving, every muscle trembling. My flashlight had fallen during the run. I groped in the dark until my fingers found it, slick with dirt. Clicked it on. The beam stabbed into the black. The tunnel opened into a chamber bigger than any room I'd ever stood in underground. The ceiling rose out of reach, swallowed by shadows. The air was damp, carrying a musky animal smell, strong but unfamiliar. Not bear, not anything I could name. Bones lay scattered across the floor. Deer, elk, smaller creatures, some fresh, some so old they had turned the color of ash. This wasn't a random cave. This was a den. I swung the beam toward the far wall and froze. 3 shapes hunched in the darkness. At first, my brain refused to register what it was seeing. Too big for humans, too wrong for bears. Dark fur clung in matted swaths to bodies built for strength. One of them was massive, easily 8 feet tall, even curled on the ground. The other 2 were smaller but still enormous. They were breathing, real heavy, deliberate breaths, the sound of something alive and powerful. My mind raced. Stories, hoaxes, blurry photographs. Impossible. They weren't supposed to be real. And yet here they were. Sleeping, or maybe only resting, in a cavern lined with bones. I wanted to run back out into the wolf pack. I wanted to wake up in my tent by the creek and believe this was all a dream. But my legs wouldn't move. A small stone shifted under my boot and skittered across the chamber. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The largest shape stirred. Slowly. It opened its eyes, 2 yellow orbs reflecting my flashlight beam, and locked on me. Everything in the world narrowed to that stare. Those eyes weren't dull or animal. They were focused, measuring, deciding. Then it began to rise. It stood with a smoothness that didn't make sense for something that size. No stiff joints, no lumbering weight, just a single, quiet movement, and it was upright, filling the chamber like a moving wall. Its head brushed the cavern roof where the stone dipped lowest. In the dim glow of my flashlight beam, I could see its hands opening and closing as if testing the air. Long fingers ending not in claws but in blunt. Dark nails like stones polished by water. The smell intensified, a mix of earth, wet fur, and something sharp and mineral, like iron after rain. I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might punch through my ribs. The 2 smaller shapes were stirring now, rolling onto their haunches. They weren't identical, one broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, the other narrower, younger, with a patch of lighter fur across its throat. Their eyes gleamed, but not, with the same hard edge as the largest one's. The young one tilted its head, curiosity written in its posture. The middle one's gaze was sharper, its mouth set in a way that reminded me of someone frowning in concentration. The largest stepped closer. Each footfall landed without sound, the way an owl drops from a branch without a whisper. It stopped less than a yard from me, bent slightly forward, and inhaled. A sound rose from deep in its chest, not a growl, not a snarl, but a low vibrating hum that rattled through my sternum. It wasn't rage, it was assessment. I'd been evaluated by doctors, bosses, even strangers in bars, but nothing had ever felt as total as that look. Those eyes were not looking at a meal. They were reading a story. A shiver ran through me. My flashlight beam trembled over their faces. The features were a puzzle, the heavy brow of a primate, but the mouth set in a way that suggested speech rather than simple vocalization. Nostrils wide and flaring like a deer catching a scent. Eyes set forward, intelligent and deliberate. I wanted to speak, but my throat was locked. My tongue glued to the roof of my mouth. I only managed a choked, "Please." The largest made a small movement with one hand, slow, deliberate, palm outward. It could have been a warning. Or it could have been the most basic signal in the world. Stay. My knees buckled and I slid down the rock behind me until I was sitting. The 2 smaller ones circled. Not closing in but angling, testing how I would react. The flashlight flickered once and a cold line of panic zipped through me. Without that beam, the cavern would be absolute black. Outside, the wolves howled again, closer. The sound skittered down the stone walls like fingernails on glass. The young one jerked its head toward the entrance, then back at me. The middle one moved first, lifting a stone as big as my torso with one hand and wedging it into the narrow gap. Dust rained down. The largest joined in, shifting a slab that must have weighed hundreds of pounds until the gap was only a slit. The wolves scratched and snarled but couldn't get through. I watched, stunned, as these creatures built a barricade in seconds. Tools, coordination, purpose. When they were done, the three of them turned back to me. The big one crouched on its haunches, arms resting loosely on its knees. The young one padded closer, holding something. It placed it on the ground near my feet, a root thick and knotted, dirt clinging to its skin. Food. My stomach twisted. I hadn't eaten since morning. I picked it up with shaking hands, scraped off some dirt with my thumb, and took a tentative bite. Bitter, fibrous, but edible. The young one made a soft puffing sound, like a sigh through a reed. The middle one echoed it lower. Approval. Time bent strangely in that cavern. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. My flashlight dimmed to a sickly glow. I turned it off to save power, plunging us into an underwater blue darkness that seemed to come from the stone itself. My eyes adjusted, shapes emerging like ghosts. Their massive bodies, the rise and fall of furred chests, faint glints of moisture on the walls. I could hear them breathing. I could hear my own heartbeat, a small frantic animal inside me. They were watching me, but not like predators, more like hosts, guardians. The largest remained near the entrance, alert, while the middle one moved around the chamber checking piles of stones, bundles of dried plants, tools lined up with quiet order. I realized these weren't random objects. This wasn't just a lair. It was a living space, organized, purposeful, a home. At some point, minutes, hours, I couldn't tell, the middle one began making sounds. Not growls, not howls, but clipped guttural syllables. It would pick up an object, make a sound, and glance at me. A rhythm, a pattern. I understood in a flash of vertigo it was trying to teach me. I whispered the English word back, rock, stick, water, and the creature would repeat my sound, shaping it clumsily in a throat not built for human speech. Then it would offer its own sound for the same object and wait for me to mimic. We built a bridge of crude vocabulary word by word, like two children inventing a game. The young one was fascinated. It crouched so close I could see the texture of its fur, thick but not matted, streaked with bits of pine needles and dust. Its eyes were a lighter amber than the largest's, softer. When I pointed at myself and said my name, it made a clicking noise, touched its chest and then touched mine. It was giving me a name in its language, friend, stranger, guest, I couldn't know for sure, but the sound carried a weight that felt almost ceremonial. Outside, the forest shifted. A breeze carried the smell of snow through the narrow gap at the entrance. The wolves were still there. I could hear their claws on stone, their low, frustrated whines. The largest creature ignored them now. It sat still, eyes half closed, but every muscle in its body held a quiet readiness, like a coiled spring waiting for a signal I couldn't hear. My exhaustion was a physical ache now. My body wanted to curl up, shut down, stop absorbing any more of this impossible night. But the creatures weren't sleeping. They stayed in motion, sorting, watching, humming low sounds to one another that vibrated the floor. I caught glimpses of markings on the walls when the faint glow shifted. Not random scratches. Lines and dots, spirals, constellations of marks that might be maps or stories or warnings. Some looked almost like calendars, others like the shapes of rivers and ridges. And one cluster was different. Crude figures, large and small, connected by faint lines. A family, a lineage, a story older than my species' memory. The young one shifted suddenly, head lifting, ears, or what passed for ears, angling toward a sound I couldn't hear yet. It moved closer to me, not away. The middle one picked up a sharpened branch. The largest rose to its full height, eyes snapping open, every line of its body tense. Outside, the wolves had changed. Their howls had gone silent. What replaced them was worse, a soft, synchronized padding of many feet on stone, circling, testing. The largest moved to the entrance, pressed its back to the boulder it had wedged there. Its shoulders swelled as it took a deep breath. A sound grew in its chest, low at first, then rising until the stone walls trembled. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't any noise I'd ever heard from an animal. It was like the earth itself speaking, a vibration so deep it slid through my ribs and into my bones. The wolves yelped and retreated, claws scraping, but they didn't leave. They regrouped in silence, waiting. The middle one placed the sharpened branch at my feet, not as a threat, as an instruction. Defend yourself if you must. Then it moved to the far side of the chamber, listening to tunnels I hadn't noticed before, darker holes swallowing the faint glow. The young one stayed close to me, its breath warm on my arm, its eyes fixed on the entrance. My hand hovered over the sharpened branch. My mind was screaming, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be seeing this. Yet a stranger's instinct rose alongside. The fear, a recognition that whatever happened next, I was inside their circle now, part of it. Witness, guest, liability, or something else entirely. The scratching at the entrance stopped. Total silence, thicker than before. I realized with a jolt that the wolves weren't at the main entrance anymore. They had found another way in. From somewhere deep in the tunnels behind us came the faint scrape of claws on stone. Getting closer, fast. The scratching grew louder, fast, frantic, echoing from the narrow tunnel behind us. The middle one froze, every muscle pulled tight as a drawn bow. The young one pressed closer, its breath quick against my arm. The big one spun toward the sound and barked something low and guttural. The other two answered in kind, the syllables sharp, clipped, language made of muscle and instinct. Then it came. A wolf burst from the darkness, a blur of fur and hunger. It hit the stone floor and skidded, teeth bared, eyes wild with starvation. The middle one was already moving, the burning branch in its hand flaring orange against the cave walls. The light caught the wolf full in the face. It flinched, yelped, but lunged again. I don't remember deciding to move. My body acted before my mind could think. I kicked at it as it came, felt my boot strike ribs, heard the dull thud. Pain shot up my leg. The wolf twisted toward me, a black streak of teeth and fury. And then the middle one's hand closed around it. The sound that followed wasn't a growl. It was a crack, bones meeting stone. The wolf went limp, slid to the ground, and vanished back into the tunnel with a whimper. Silence flooded the cave. I could taste iron on my tongue. The middle one turned to me, chest heaving, eyes scanning my face, my arms, my legs. Then slowly, it placed one massive hand on my shoulder, warm, solid, gentle. The same gesture it had made before, friend. The tension bled out of me so fast I almost collapsed. The middle one exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and exhaustion. It looked at the big one and made a sound I hadn't heard before. A high, lilting chirp like a question and an answer at once. The big one responded with a single grunt and shifted more stones over the tunnel mouth, sealing it completely. We spent the rest of that night waiting, listening. Outside, the wolves howled again, defeated now farther away. Their calls echoed off the cliffs, fading into the valley. Inside, the three of them kept watch. I sat by the fire's dying light, numb and trembling, unable to process the fact that I was still alive. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, pale light was leaking. Through the narrow entrance dawn, the cave smelled of damp moss and smoke. The three creatures were stirring. The big one rolled the boulder aside just enough to look out, sniffed the air, then grunted, a sound that meant safe. The young one chirped back softly, stretching long arms overhead. They began to gather things, tools, bags woven from bark, bundles of dried roots tied with vine. The big one gestured to me, palm down, then a slow motion downward. Stay, wait. I understood. I sat near the fire pit while they worked. The young one approached, carrying a bundle of leaves and grass. It spread them into a rough mat beside me, then patted it gently, like showing a child where to sleep. It wanted me to rest, to recover. When they finally left, they moved the boulder almost back into place, leaving a thin crack for air. I was alone. The silence that followed was immense. The kind of silence that isn't absence but presence, the world listening to itself. I stood and looked around. The walls told stories I hadn't noticed before, scratched lines running like rivers, dots marking cycles of something, moons maybe or seasons. There were crude shapes of animals, deer, elk, bears, and beside them, smaller marks, handprints, not human, too wide, too long but placed deliberately, pressed into clay that had hardened with time. Generations of them. One wall stopped me cold. There were three figures carved deeper than the rest, one large, one medium, one small, and beside them, a new mark, fresh, the clay still darker where it had dried unevenly, a small uneven outline shaped like a human hand, mine. They had done it while I slept, a record, a mark that I had been here, that I existed to them. I sat there for a long time staring at that wall. The fire was nothing but ash. I added a few pieces from their woodpile, careful not to disturb anything else. The smoke drifted up through a narrow chimney crack just as before. Thought out, designed. Everything about this place whispered intelligence, not just survival, culture, memory. By the time they returned, I had stopped feeling afraid. I was still shaking, but it wasn't terror anymore. It was awe. The boulder shifted. Daylight spilled in, cold and bright. They entered carrying bundles, roots, mushrooms, berries, something that looked like dried meat. They set everything out neatly on a flat rock, dividing it into portions. The young one brought me some, offering it with both hands. Its eyes were brighter in the morning light, amber, curious, kind. I ate what they gave me. The food was rough but real, earthy roots. Bitter greens, meat tough as bark but filling. The middle one watched, nodding once when I swallowed. The big one ate last, taking a share only after the others finished. Hierarchy. Order. Afterward, the middle one walked to the wall with the map-like markings and pointed at different symbols, then at me, then toward the forest beyond the entrance. I understood what it was asking. Where do you belong? I mimed walking with 2 fingers, then pointed toward what I thought was east, where the main trail should have been. The middle one studied me, then the wall, then traced a path between 2 sets of markings with a blunt finger. It looked back at me and grunted softly. It knew. They were going to take me back. But not yet. The big one made a sound that was unmistakably command. The sun wasn't high enough. The forest wasn't safe. We would leave when it was time. I sat waiting while they moved about their space, each task deliberate and calm. The young one practiced shaping, stones into blades under the big one's watchful gaze. The middle one repaired a torn vine bag. The domesticity of it all felt impossible. Hours passed. Then finally the big one rose, stretched, and pointed at the entrance. It was time. They gathered their tools, slung their packs over one shoulder. The middle one gestured for me to follow. The sunlight outside was blinding after the dim cave. The forest felt different, still cold, brittle with frost. The world I knew seemed smaller now, as if I'd stepped from a cathedral into a room. We moved in silence. Their steps made no sound. Mine crunched and snapped like thunder in comparison. The big one led, the middle one behind me, the young one flanking to my right. They moved through the terrain with effortless grace, never breaking stride. I stumbled constantly, trying to keep up. After what felt like hours, we reached a ridge where I could hear the distant hum of cars, civilization, the trail. My heart jumped. The big one stopped, turned, and raised its hand. Wait. We crouched behind a curtain of ferns as a pair of hikers passed below us, their laughter echoing faintly. They had no idea. None at all. The big one pointed toward the trail, then at me. Its eyes held mine for a long, steady moment. Go. The middle one made a soft clicking noise. The young one tilted its head almost sadly. I took a step forward, then another. My boots met the dirt of the trail. When I turned back, they were already fading into the trees. One blink and the forest had swallowed them completely. I walked for 6 miles without stopping. When I reached my car, frost glittered on the windshield. My hands shook so hard I dropped the keys twice before I managed to start the engine. On the drive home, my mind replayed every second. The cave, the drawings, the language, the kindness. The eyes that saw me and decided not to kill me. The creatures that should not exist but do. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, staring at my hands. I could still feel the weight of that touch on my shoulder. Warm, heavy, real. And somewhere deep in those mountains, 3 shapes were probably watching the sunrise, adding another mark to their wall. But something about the memory wouldn't settle. Something small, wrong. In one corner of my last photograph, one I'd taken before I got lost, I noticed a shadow behind the trees, broad shoulders, long arms, watching me even before I knew they were there. Weeks passed before I said a word to anyone. I told my boss I'd taken a bad fall while hiking and needed rest. Told my friends I just didn't feel like going out. None of that was true. The truth lived behind my eyes, replaying in flashes whenever I blinked. Yellow eyes, firelight against fur, that soft hand pressing my shoulder with impossible gentleness. The world outside felt different. Too loud, too sharp. Every sound seemed artificial after the forest. The hum of streetlights, the whine of tires on wet asphalt, the endless buzz of human life. My apartment walls felt thinner, like if I pressed my ear against them, I'd hear the forest breathing on the other side. For a while I convinced myself it had to be hallucination. Sleep deprivation, shock, adrenaline, maybe even oxygen starvation. I told myself that until I almost believed it. Until the nightmares started. They weren't like normal dreams. They came in fragments, flickers of movement in the dark, the glow of fire on stone. The middle one's face watching me, expression unreadable. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart hammering, the smell of pine and smoke filling my nose as if the cave were just beyond my bedroom wall. One night I woke to something stranger. My window was open. I never leave it open. Cold air drifted in, carrying the faintest scent of moss and rain. I looked outside, nothing. No movement, no sound. Just my backyard, wet with dew, but pressed into the soft soil. Below the window were prints, wide, deep, too big for a man, too narrow for a bear. They led away into the tree line and vanished. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat at the edge of my bed until dawn, staring at those prints through the glass until the light erased them. In the mornings, I'd scroll through Bigfoot sighting forums, dozens of posts from people who claimed they'd seen something in the Cascades, shadows crossing roads, shapes at the edge of campsites, recordings of guttural calls echoing through valleys. Most were obvious fakes, but a few sounded too close to what I'd heard to dismiss. I typed out my own post more than once, detailed, honest, but I never hit send, because what would that do? If people believed me, it would only bring cameras, hunters, scientists. And if they didn't, it would destroy what little piece I had left. Instead, I kept it to myself. But silence has weight, and mine was growing heavier. About a month after the incident, I decided to go back. Not to prove anything, just to see. I told myself I'd only go as far as the ridge. Maybe take a few pictures, then leave. But the moment I parked at that same trailhead, my hands started shaking. The forest felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Watching, listening. The first miles were easy, familiar, almost comforting. But somewhere near that unmarked fork, the air changed again. The same faint metallic tang. The same sense that the trees weren't just standing there, but waiting. I stopped and listened. Nothing, then faintly a low click. Almost like a stone striking another stone. I knew that sound. I should have turned back. Instead, I followed it. The forest grew darker the farther I went. Clouds rolled in, blotting out the sun, turning the woods into a dim, shifting maze. My breath fogged in the cold. My boots slid on wet leaves. But every few minutes, that sound came again. Click, click. A rhythm, almost deliberate. Then I saw it, half hidden beneath a fallen pine. The same cave entrance. Smaller than I remembered. Or maybe the forest had grown thicker around it. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears. I crouched near the opening and shined my flashlight inside. Nothing but blackness. No sound, no movement. Just the cold breath of earth coming out to meet me. I called out, quietly, uncertain what I even expected to happen. Nothing answered. I waited. 5 minutes, 10. Then faintly from somewhere deep inside, a single low note. Not a growl, not speech, but something in between. A sound that rose through the rock like heat, vibrating in my chest. My flashlight flickered. The air grew heavy. I stepped back instinctively, my throat dry. And then I saw it, etched near the entrance on the stone wall, half covered by moss. A new mark beside the others. A human handprint. Smaller than mine, fresh. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it. Long enough for the sky to darken. For the forest to start whispering with the wind again. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to leave, but the rest of me couldn't move. It wasn't fear holding me. It was something closer to recognition. I reached out and pressed my palm against that print. The stone was cold, wet, but beneath that, faint warmth, like the heat of something living had been there not long before. A twig snapped behind me. I turned, flashlight jerking wildly across the trees. Nothing. Just fog, mist curling low to the ground. But the forest had gone silent again. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the pregnant kind full of things unseen. I backed away from the cave. Step by step, my boot caught on a root and I stumbled. The flashlight rolled from my hand and spun on the ground, its beam slicing across the trees. That's when I saw them. 3 shapes standing at the edge of the fog, still as statues, watching. The biggest stood in front, half in shadow, half in moonlight. The middle one behind it, head tilted, eyes glinting faint gold. And beside them, the smallest. The young one, holding something in its hand. I froze. My heart didn't beat. It pounded like something trying to escape. None of them moved. The young one took a single step forward, arm lifting. I couldn't see what it held until the beam of the flashlight caught it. A small, folded piece of dark bark. It placed it on the ground and stepped back. I didn't move until the fog began to thicken again, swallowing their shapes one by one until the forest was empty. The sound of leaves in the wind returned, and with it, the world. I picked up the piece of bark with trembling hands. It was carved with lines, 3 tall figures and 1 smaller, human-shaped, all connected by a single line. That was the last time I saw them. I never told anyone. Not really. Not in a way that mattered. The story lives only here. In these words, I can barely bring myself to speak. People think monsters are what hide in the dark, but I learned something else in those mountains. Monsters don't always attack. Sometimes they rescue. Sometimes they choose mercy, and that makes them more human than we are. I still have that piece of bark. It sits on my desk under glass, Some nights when the wind blows from the west, I swear it hums, low and steady, like a memory trying to speak. If you ever find yourself in the Cascade wilderness and the forest goes quiet, don't run, don't shout, don't look for a signal. Just listen. You might not be alone.